In this video, I'm going to show you how to use a Japanese style pole saw. Hey guys, welcome back to David's DIY Reviews. On this channel we do a lot of DIY projects, tool reviews, and tool tutorials just like this one. So if you're new to the channel, consider subscribing for a lot more really great content. Today I'm going to be showing you guys everything you need to know to start using these Japanese pole saws. There's a lot of great uses that these saws have over a traditional Western style saw, and a lot of cool little tricks that you may not know that these saws can do. So let's get into it. The type of saw we're going to be using today is a Ryoba Japanese pole saw. These styles have teeth on both sides of the blades. One side is going to be a coarser kind of rip tooth, and the other side is going to be a finer cross-cut tooth. There's two other main types of pole saws, one of which only has teeth on one side, and one of which has a back support, kind of like a tenon saw. So the first thing, and probably the most obvious about a Japanese style pole saw, is they're going to do all the cutting on the pole stroke. Unlike a more traditional Western style saw that's going to do its cutting on the push stroke. Which brings me to my next point. Like a traditional Western style saw, you're going to pull it back to get the cut started because that's the opposite way of the teeth. With a pole saw, you're going to push the saw forward, just a couple light strokes, and using your thumb to guide the blade. And then once you get that curve started, then you can start to actually pull the saw and begin your cut. And a really useful way to make through cuts with a pole saw is once you get your cut started, because you've got coarser teeth on the top and finer ones on the bottom, you can get your cut started and then flip the saw over and do the majority of the cut with the coarser teeth. And probably the first most important tip I have for you guys who are new with a pole saw is with a traditional style Western saw, you're going to push forward and the teeth are going to cut down through the grain. But with a pole saw, because the teeth are cutting back like this, you're going to want to pull back and down. That way you're pulling the teeth down through the grain of the wood. If you pull up like this, you're going to find that you're ripping up the grain and kind of having a lot of tear out with your cut. So you always want to be pulling down to make your cuts. Always down and back. Also, you'll find as you start using your pole saw, you'll find, it's kind of nice to get started with one hand, but as you get cutting, you can kind of switch to two hands, and that'll maybe be a little easier for you. Kind of whatever works for you. One or two hands, either one is pretty comfortable. And you're going to always want to pull straight back to your body when you're cutting through. One thing you will probably notice with a Japanese pole saw, though, is because the blades are really thin, you're going to find if you get offline as you're cutting through, it's a lot harder to correct. Traditional Western style saws have thicker blades and you can kind of correct as you go through. But if you start your cut a little off with one of these saws, it's going to be really difficult to correct as you go. But the advantage of the thin blade and actually pulling back on the cut is once you get your cut going straight, it's going to stay straight, because when you're cutting, you've got tension on the saw. Because you're cutting on the pull stroke, it's putting tension on the blade, just like kind of pulling a string tight. With a traditional, Western style saw, you're pushing the blade and it's making the blade want to bend. But when you're pulling the blade, it's always keeping it tight and keeping tension on it. And so it's going to make a nice straight cut. And that's what actually allows the blades to be so thin, is because you're cutting on the pull stroke. That's a really great advantage of these type of saws. The other advantage of the blade design on these Japanese pole saws is they are removable. So as you wear out the blade, you can remove the blade and put a new one in. That's really nice. Another really neat trick that these saws have is, I don't know how clearly you can see, but the last tooth is kind of a long extended tooth. And where that tooth meets depth-wise is the same depth as the last tooth. So when you're doing joinery work, what tends to happen with these saws is you start cutting and you end up with kind of a curve at the bottom of your cut. I've kind of cut it like this just to show an example of how it works. But what you do then is you take that angled cut and you run it along the bottom of your cut to flatten it. And what it does is it just pulls that last tooth across the bottom of your cut and it kind of joints it out flat. That's a really nice advantage. So if you're doing, tenant work and you want to have it nice and flat, you cut down and then you just drag that across, and that gets you a perfect straight cut on the bottom. It's a really kind of neat trick that these type of saws have over a traditional, kind of Western saw. Another big advantage of the blades being flexible like this is that you can do flush cuts. If you had a peg sticking up, or a situation like this where you might want to cut it flush like this, you can cut. Or if you had on your tabletop, you can't really see that. If you had a peg coming out of a tabletop and you need to cut it flush, you can run the saw along the surface like that. And sometimes I know these Japanese style tools and Japanese woodworking techniques can be a little daunting, can be a little difficult looking, but if you give them a try, they're a lot of fun, they're kind of neat, you learn a lot. These pull saws are probably one of the best ways to get into Japanese style woodworking. And if you happen to be needing some tips and tricks or a little technique, build your skills on other woodworking tools, check out this playlist in the YouTube card above. It's a lot of great content on, tutorials, how-to videos on traditional Western style woodworking hand tools. There's a lot of great content in there that's going to help you build your skills. And leave it in the comments below if maybe you guys have some tips or tricks to Japanese pull saws that I forgot to mention, or that maybe are, like a must-have trick that I didn't really follow up on in this video. And remember guys, new videos every week. Check me out, a lot of great content. David's DIY Reviews. See you in the next video.